She had been in that cold stone room for hours, wrists raw from rope, when she heard the window above her head begin to move. No voice, no signal. Just a large hand reaching through the dark, a knife that caught no light, and the rope falling away in silence. He had climbed a mountain barefoot in the dead of night, so the stone could not betray him. She had known he would come, not because he was fearless, because he was the kind of man who kept his word. This is the story of how they found each other and what it cost to keep what they built. The blood was not hers. That was the first thing Nell Bennett understood when she opened her eyes in the dark, her wrists raw from rope. She could not see the cold of the stone floor pressing up through her skirt like a warning. Somewhere outside the narrow window above her head, the Colorado sky was doing what it always did up here in the high country, filling itself with more stars than any one person had a right to witness, pouring them out across the black like spilled salt on a cloth that had no edges. She had been in this room for hours. She knew that much. She did not know where exactly. She knew the direction they had ridden northwest, climbing the whole time, the air thinning around her as the horses labored up slopes she could not see. She knew there were three men. She knew the one who had taken her was not acting out of greed or madness, at least not the kind of madness that burned bright and burned out. His was the other kind, the cold kind, the kind that had been feeding itself for a long time on something that never ran out. She did not know in that moment that Garrett Calloway was already moving through the dark below her. She did not know that he had left his boots at the base of the ridge and was climbing the northern face in bare feet, feeling the stone with his toes, the way a blind man reads a page slow and certain, and making no sound that the night air could carry. She did not know that he had done this before in other mountains, in other dark, for reasons the country had asked of men his age when they were still young enough to believe it mattered who won. She did not know any of that. But here is what she did know, sitting in that cold room with her back against the stone and her heart keeping time in her chest like a clock someone had wound too tight. She knew she was not going to sit still and wait. She knew the 8 pieces of torn fabric she had left on the trail behind her were the most important things she had ever done. And she knew with the particular certainty of a woman who had grown up watching her mother read the land and the body with the same patient intelligence that the man who had written those letters would come. Not because he was fearless, because he was the kind of man who kept his word. She pressed her back harder against the stone and watched the stars through that narrow window and waited, and her hands, which were cold and aching, stayed still. Outside in the dark below, a man moved without sound through the pines. That is where we begin. Go back 6 weeks. Go back to Boston, to the smell of coal smoke and river mud, to the particular gray of an August morning in a city that had forgotten how to be quiet. Go back to a room on the 3rd floor of a building that leaned slightly to the east. A room barely wide enough for a single bed, a small table, and a woman sitting at that table with a letter in her hands that she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Nell Bennett was 22 years old. She had her mother's hands long-fingered and quick-stained faintly at the knuckle from years of working with plants whose colors did not wash out easily. She had her father's eyes, a blue so pale it's sometimes red as gray, in certain lights, attentive and steady, the eyes of someone who listened to what you said rather than simply waiting for you to finish. She was slight in the way of women who have worked hard since childhood, not delicate but lean, economical. In her movements, a person who had learned early that effort was a currency and waste was something you could not afford. Her father had been a doctor, not a wealthy one. He was the kind of doctor who charged what people could pay, which in the neighborhood where they lived meant he sometimes came home with a or preserved peaches instead of coin, and her mother thought this was fine. Her mother was the kind of woman who would rather have the peaches. She knew what to do with them. She knew what to do with almost everything that grew, and she spent Nell's childhood teaching her daughter with the same methodical care that Nell's father spent teaching the body's mechanics. Between the two of them, they gave her a mind that could see a plant and know its purpose, read a wound and know its depth, and understand that most of what the world needed was attention and patience and a willingness to work with what was actually there rather than what you wished were there. Both of them were gone. Her father first 3 years ago, his heart giving out without warning on a Tuesday afternoon in February, the kind of death that was quick and left no time for anything useful to be said. Her mother, 18 months later, a lung sickness that moved slowly enough that they had time to say everything, which was both a mercy and its own particular kind of hard. What they left behind was a small debt, a room that was not hers, a wooden chest packed with dried herbs and tinctures, and her mother's handwritten notes, and two hands that knew how to work. What Boston offered in return for those hands was almost nothing. The city had doctors. It did not need an unlicensed woman who knew plants. The sewing work she could find paid barely enough for the room that was not hers. The city that had been home when her parents were alive had become in their absence simply a place she happened to be standing, getting colder each month as the small savings ran down. She had not answered the advertisement out of desperation exactly. Or perhaps desperation was the wrong word for it. It was more like clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when you have been honest with yourself long enough to see the situation plain. The advertisement had appeared in a Boston paper on a morning in late June. She had almost skipped past it. Mail order arrangements had a reputation that made most sensible women hesitate, and Nell Bennett was nothing if not sensible. But something in the wording stopped her, and she read it twice and then a third time. It said strong woman needed, Mountain Homestead. Hard life, fair man, not promising comfort, not promising ease, promising fairness, which was in her experience the rarest of the three. She wrote back. She received a letter in return. She wrote again and again. A letter came, and by the end of the second month there were 7 letters between them, and she had read each of his so many times the folds were worn through. The letters were not what she expected. She had expected practical information, what the ranch required, what she would be expected to do. She got some of that, yes, but underneath it, running through it the way a current runs through cold water, there was something else. A kind of honesty that was awkward and ungainly and utterly without pretense. A man trying to describe himself accurately and finding the task difficult not because he was hiding things, but because accurate self-description requires a kind of detachment he clearly found hard to manage. One letter in particular she had returned to more than any other. He had written, "I am not good at letters. My brother says I have more to say than I think. I believe he is right, but I do not know how to prove it on paper. What I can tell you is this: I am not looking for someone to cook or clean. I can do both well enough. I am looking for someone to sit across the table from. Someone who can look at these mountains and not be afraid. I do not know if that is you. I would like to find out." That was all. No flourishes, no promises that could not be kept. She had written back and told him about her mother's medicine chest and what was in it. She had described her father's practice and what she had learned watching him work. She had told him that she was not afraid of hard things, only of useless ones. She packed lightly. One trunk her clothes, the medicine chest wrapped in a wool blanket, the bundle of letters tied with a piece of blue ribbon she had cut from a dress that was too worn to travel in. She left Boston on a Tuesday morning in late August with the particular feeling of someone who has just turned a page. 5 days on the train was not comfortable and was not meant to be. The car she rode in smelled of coal and tobacco, and the particular tired smell of people who had been sitting too long in the same air. She sat by the window and watched the country change. It changed in ways she had not expected. The cities thinning and then gone, replaced by something vast and flat that seemed to go on forever. And then on the 4th day, the shapes on the horizon that were at first almost nothing. Just darker patches where the sky met the earth that grew slowly over hours into something that rearranged the inside of her chest. Mountains, real ones. Not the gentle hills of New England, but great gray walls of stone that rose without apology out of the earth and held the sky up at a height that made her feel for the first time in years small in a way that was not diminishing but clarifying. Small the way you feel in a cathedral, reminded of proportion, reminded that the world was older than your troubles and would outlast them. She pressed her forehead against the glass and breathed slowly. One of the letters was in her hand. She had taken it out without thinking about it, the way you reach for something familiar when the unfamiliar is too much to take in all at once. She read it again, the one about sitting across the table. She looked at the mountains. She thought about the man who lived among them and had described them in a later letter as the only honest thing he had encountered since the war. She put the letter away. She watched the mountains come closer. The station at Mancos was smaller than she had imagined it, which was saying something because she had imagined it small. A wooden platform, a roof held up by posts that had been painted once and were peeling now slowly in long strips that curled away from the wood like something trying to escape. The smell of the air when she stepped off the train was nothing like Boston. It was clean in a way that felt almost aggressive after years of city living, thin and cold at the edges despite the August heat, and carrying underneath everything else the smell of pine resin and stone and altitude. She stood on the platform with her trunk beside her and her medicine chest in her arms and looked around. There was no one waiting who looked like the description she had formed in her mind over 7 letters. She had built an image the way you do when you have only words to work with a man who was probably quieter in person than he seemed on paper, who probably filled a room without trying to. She had imagined a certain quality of stillness in him. She had been prepared to work with that. What she had not been prepared for was the absence. There were 2 men. They were clearly related. The resemblance was in the architecture of the face, the same strong jaw and high cheekbones, the same quality of physical presence that suggested generations of outdoor work rather than anything cultivated. But they were otherwise as different in presentation as 2 people sharing a bloodline could be. The one on the left was watching her the way a man watches the horizon when he is trying to determine if weather is coming. Not hostile, not welcoming, simply assessing with the particular economy of someone who does not expend energy on courtesy until he has established whether courtesy is warranted. His eyes were the color of amber in low light, and they were currently doing the thing that amber does in low light, which is to let very little in and give very little away. The one on the right was already moving toward her, and his eyes, which were a warmer brown, were doing something more readable. He was trying not to show that he felt guilty about something. He was not succeeding completely. "Miss Bennett." He reached her and took the trunk before she could protest with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being useful. "I'm Sawyer Calloway, and this," he glanced back at the one with the amber eyes, the glance carrying the weight of a complicated history between brothers, "is Cole. Garrett had something come up at the ranch. One of the mares. He asked me to tell you he's sorry." Nell looked at Sawyer, then she looked at Cole, who had not moved and had not spoken and showed no sign of intending to do either. "I understand," she said. Her voice was level. She had decided somewhere on the train that she was going to be level. Livestock doesn't wait for convenient timing. Sawyer looked at her with an expression she recognized as recalibration. He had been expecting something different. He was adjusting. Cole said nothing, but he walked to the wagon and lifted her trunk into the bed with a single clean motion, the way you move something that has weight but does not require dramatic effort, and that told her something about him that the silence had not. The drive to the ranch took 3 hours. The road climbed without apology, switchbacking up slopes where the pines grew so thick and straight they looked like columns holding up a ceiling that was all scheming. The air changed as they climbed, thinning in a way she could feel at the base of her throat, and the smell of pine resin strengthened until it was the whole world, complex and clean and ancient in a way that the city never managed. Sawyer talked. He had the gift of filling silence without making it feel invaded, chatting about the ranch and the seasons, and the neighbors, of which there were few, the nearest being a man named Aldous Prentice, who ran cattle on the flats 6 miles east and was, according to Sawyer, reliable in emergencies and unbearable at meals. Cole said almost nothing. But once, when the road dipped unexpectedly and the wagon lurched sideways on wet stone and Nell grabbed for the seat board, Cole's arm moved. One motion, no thought behind it, just the reflex of someone whose instinct was to prevent a fall. She didn't need it. Her balance held. But she noticed it. She noticed the mountains more. She had thought she was prepared after 5 days of watching them grow from specks on the horizon to the great gray walls she had pressed her forehead against the glass to see. She was not prepared. You couldn't be. They did something to the scale of everything that no description could anticipate, rising above the tree line in sheer faces of stone that held the afternoon light like it was theirs by right. She found herself breathing differently, slower, as if the place itself was asking her to match its pace. "You're quiet," Sawyer observed. He had been watching her watch the mountains with a curious expression. "They're larger than I expected," she said, "and I expected them large." Sawyer smiled. There was something in the smile that she couldn't read fully, some layer of it that had a different color than the rest. He said, "Most women from back east say they're oppressive." "They are," she said, "but oppressive the good way. The way that reminds you the world is bigger than whatever's worrying you. He looked at her for a moment, then he turned back to the road without comment. But she had the sense that she had passed some small test whose parameters she had not been told. Cole in the front said nothing, but his shoulders, which had been set with the particular tension of a man braced for something unpleasant, shifted almost imperceptibly toward ease. The ranch appeared around a curve in the road that delivered it without warning. One moment there was the road and the trees and the slope, and then there was the curve, and then there was the clearing, and the sight of it stopped, her breathing for a moment without her permission. A main cabin of logs and stone that was bigger than she had expected, solid in a way that spoke of permanence and intention rather than expedience. A barn to the left, weathered silver. A kitchen garden along the south face of the cabin, still productive this late in the season, the last of the summer vegetables heavy on their stakes. Corrals to the north. And around everything above, everything in every direction, the mountains blue-gray in the afternoon light, holding the whole scene in their cupped hands like something they had decided to keep. A man was standing in the yard. He had been working. That was the first thing you noticed, because the work was still on him, a quality of recent effort. A bandana pushed up off his forehead, the sleeves of his shirt rolled to the elbow. He was tall in the way that the brothers were tall, but there was more of it, more height and more breadth, the kind of physical presence that you felt before you fully registered the details of it. He heard the wagon and turned. And Nell Bennett, who had read 7 letters from this man and constructed a careful, considered image of who he might be, looked at Garrett Calloway for the first time and felt something she had not entirely anticipated. Not disappointment, not quite. Something more complicated. The man who had written those letters, who had described his loneliness with such careful, graceless honesty, who had said he wanted someone to sit across the table from him, and had meant it in a way that was not a euphemism for anything else, that man was in there somewhere. She could see it in the way he moved across the yard, deliberate and unhurried, the way a man moves when he is not performing for anyone. But the man standing in front of her was also contained in some way that the letters were not. Locked down behind his eyes, which were gray and direct, and gave her the impression of looking at a landscape from the outside rather than being invited into it. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at her. "Miss Bennett," he said, "good trip," 7 words, even and toneless as a plank of cured oak. She had built up 7 letters worth of this man. She had believed she knew something real about him. And standing there in the late afternoon light of a Colorado yard, looking up at the face that went with the handwriting, she understood for the first time the difference between knowing someone on paper and meeting them in the world. "Acceptable," she said. "Thank you for the arrangements." He nodded. He said, "Sawyer will show you the room." Then he turned and walked back toward the horses. Sawyer beside her cleared his throat. He said quietly, "He's not cold. He's just—" He trailed off, searching for the right word. He didn't find it. "I know," Nell said. And she thought she did. Or she thought she knew the shape of it at least. She had read enough of his letters to know that the man who had written them had not written them easily. But there was something else she had noticed, something she did not say aloud. The room Sawyer showed her was small and clean and deliberate. The window had been washed. The curtain was fresh, not new. She could see the age in the fabric, but freshly laundered and rehung. On the corner of the small table, placed with the particular carefulness of someone who wanted to provide comfort, but was uncertain how to do it naturally, was a small jar containing dried wildflowers. She stood in the doorway and looked at those flowers for a moment. "Who arranged the room?" she asked. Sawyer hesitated, one beat too long to be nothing. "Garrett," he said. She looked at the flowers. She looked at the window. She thought about the man who had just told her she'd had a good trip in 7 flat words, and then walked away to tend his horses. She set her medicine chest on the table, sat down on the edge of the bed, and thought that the distance between who a person was and how they presented themselves to the world was sometimes enormous, and that crossing it required patience. She was good at patience. The first morning she woke before the sun and went to the kitchen. She did not ask permission. She did not know where anything was, so she opened every drawer and cabinet in turn until she did, moving quietly through the dim space that smelled of wood smoke and coffee grounds, and the mineral smell of mountain water. She found the oats. She found the coffee. She built up the fire from the banked coals and put water on and started a pot of oatmeal, and by the time the sky outside was gray enough to see by, there were 4 servings of breakfast. waiting on the table in a pot of coffee that smelled like something worth getting out of bed for. Sawyer came in first just after dawn and stopped short when he saw the table set. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. Reassessment. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "I was up anyway." Garrett came in 20 minutes later, moving through the kitchen toward the coffee with the directional focus of a man who had a ritual and intended to complete it, and he poured himself a cup and drank half of it, standing at the window before he appeared to notice the table. He looked at it. He looked at her. She was sitting at the table with her own coffee, watching him without making a production of it. He sat down. He ate. He didn't say anything for a long time. Cole came in last, took in the situation in one sweep of those amber eyes, and sat down and ate without ceremony, and that was the breakfast. Afterward, when they had all gone to their work, Cole paused at the door. "There's a mare in the near corral," he said without turning around. "Front left fetlock, swelling." Nell said, "I'll look at it." He didn't say anything else. He went out. She found the horse in the corral that afternoon, a bay with good lines and the particular expression of an animal that is in pain and has decided to be difficult about it. Cole was already there attempting to get close enough to see the injury and being consistently denied. The horse kept moving away, not in fear, but in the deliberate way of something that has learned that moving away delays the unpleasantness. Nell came through the gate and stopped a few feet inside and did not look at the horse. She let the horse notice she was there. Then she started talking quietly, nothing in particular, the kind of low, steady sound that her mother had used when she visited the sick. Not the words mattering, but the tone, the rhythm, the simple fact of a voice that was not making demands. She moved a little, stopped, moved again. The horse's ears turned toward her. She waited. It took 8 minutes before the horse stood still and let her approach. She ran her hands down the leg without urgency, assessing with her fingers the way her mother had taught her. And when she straightened up, she had a clear picture of what she was dealing with. Not severe, not nothing. Inflammation that had been building for probably 2 or 3 days caught early enough that it could be managed with the right application. "I can treat this," she said. "I need the dried bone set and goldenrod from my medicine chest. Clean cloth, hot water." Cole said, "Where do you keep it?" "Top shelf, a left side paper packet. The goldenrod is the one that smells like hay." He went and came back, and they worked together without further conversation, Nell preparing the poultice while Cole held the horse steady with the patient practiced competence of someone who had been managing large animals his whole life. They worked close enough to each other that she was aware of his attention, not on her, but on the horse, absolute and focused. And when they were done and the leg was wrapped and the horse had decided it was willing to accept this development, Cole stepped back and looked at the work. "You know what you're doing," he said. "Not a compliment exactly, an acknowledgement of fact." "My mother knew plants," Nell said. "She taught me. Most women from cities don't know boneset from dandelion." "My mother wasn't most women," Nell said. Cole studied her for a moment with those amber eyes that were always doing more than they appeared to be doing. Then he said, "Garrett will want to know the horse will be sound." "In 4 days, if the inflammation doesn't worsen," she said. He nodded and left. That evening at supper, the conversation was sparse, as it had been the night before, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of a space where an unknown quantity has been introduced. It was something quieter than that and more comfortable. When the table was cleared, she went to her room and sat with her medicine chest open on the table and went through the inventory the way her mother had taught her, systematic and thorough, making notes in the small book that she kept for the purpose. The lamp was burning low and the window was dark and the mountains outside were invisible, but present, enormous and close, and she could hear the wind in the pines coming from the high slopes. She was aware distantly of movement in the rest of the cabin, the sounds of a house at the end of a working day, boots on floorboards, the door to the yard opening and closing, the particular settling sound of a fire being banked. She was also aware that she had not yet had a real conversation with Garrett Calloway beyond the 7 words he had offered at her arrival. She thought about the dried wildflowers on her table. She thought about the letters. On the 4th day, she went into the small room behind the main bedroom that served as a library and a study, looking for a book she had noticed the first evening, a natural history of mountain plants that would be useful alongside what her mother had taught her. She had asked Sawyer if she could borrow it. He had said, of course, that room was open to everyone. What she found in the room first was a different kind of text. She hadn't been prying. She had been reaching for the natural history on the upper shelf, and a folded paper had slipped from between two books and fallen to the floor, and she picked it up, intending to replace it without looking. And then she saw the handwriting. She stood very still. The handwriting on the fallen paper was the same as the handwriting in the letters. The angular, slightly left-leaning hand that she had spent 2 months learning to read the particular way the capital letters stood as if braced against weather. But this paper was not a letter she had received. It was something else. She read the first 3 lines and then stopped herself and folded it again. She stood there with it in her hands and looked at the bookshelf and thought about what she was doing. Then she opened it again and read the rest. He had written, "Nell, I have been sitting in front of this paper for an hour. Sawyer says to write what I actually think. He says you will respond better to that than to fancy words. I am trying to believe him. What I actually think is this. I am 34 years old and I have built something here worth being proud of. And I have no one to leave it to and no one to sit on the porch with in the evening and watch the light change on the high peaks, which changes in a way I have never found adequate words for, though I have tried more times than I will admit. That is not the whole of it. The whole of it is harder to write because it requires being honest about a kind of loneliness that feels like something missing in Dodd rather than something missing outside. I cannot explain it better than that. I thought I had stopped wanting things. Your first letter was the first evidence I had received in some years that I had not. I signed it Garrett, then crossed it out, then wrote it again. Beneath the signature, the page was blank. She read it twice. Then she went through the rest of the shelf, not searching exactly, but attentive, and found the box under the writing desk almost by accident, a plain wooden box with no lock, and inside it were more papers, all in the same hand, all addressed to her. There were 11 of them. She sat on the floor with her back against the bookshelf and read them all. They were nothing like the letters she had received. Or rather, they were entirely like the letters she had received in the way that a rough sketch is like the finished painting the same subject in the same underlying structure, but with none of the smoothing and editing that intervened. These were the letters before the letters, the thoughts before they had been shaped for an audience. They were the writing of a man who was trying to be honest with himself and finding the process uncomfortable, circling back on his own sentences with the perseverance of someone who believes that if he keeps at it long enough, the truth will finally come out straight. In one of them, he had written, "I am not easy to live with. I know this about myself. I go quiet for days at a time and cannot explain it and would not know how to explain it even if I tried. The war did something to me that I do not have good words for, and I have stopped trying to find them. What I know is this. There are days when the silence here is a mercy, and there are days when it sits on me like a stone, and I cannot tell in advance which kind of day it will be until I am already inside it. In another, you asked in your last letter about what I find beautiful. I wrote you a fair answer about the mountains at dawn. That was not the honest answer. The honest answer is that the thing I find most beautiful is competence. Watching someone do a hard thing well. My youngest brother plays the fiddle after supper sometimes, and the sound of it in this cabin in winter is the most beautiful thing in my daily life, and I have never said that to him because I do not know how to say it without it coming out wrong. She read them all. Then she sat quietly in the near dark of that room with the box closed on her lap and the natural history of mountain plants forgotten on the shelf above her, and thought about what the letters she had received actually were. She heard footsteps in the hall. She stood up. She put the box back where she had found it the way she had found it. She took the natural history from the shelf and turned around, and Garrett Calloway filled the doorway. He stopped when he saw her. She held up the book. Sawyer said I could borrow this. He looked at the book. He looked at her face. Whatever he saw there, he read in the particular way he had of reading things slow and complete, not missing much. It's useful, he said. There's a chapter on the San Juan Range specifically. That's what I was hoping for. She moved toward the door, and he stepped aside, and she was almost past him when she stopped. She looked at the bookshelf. She looked at him. The flowers in my room, she said. Thank you for that. It was a kind thing to do. Something moved in his face. Not much, but something. Seemed like a long way to come to an empty room, he said. She nodded and went out. That evening, Sawyer found her on the south side of the cabin in the last of the day's light, taking inventory of the kitchen garden. She heard him coming and kept working, and he settled himself on the fence post and watched for a while. "You found the box," he said. She kept her hands in the bean plants. "One paper fell out of a book. I put it back. But you saw the box." She straightened up and looked at him. Sawyer was watching her with an expression that was trying to be casual and not managing it. He was young enough to 27 to not yet have mastered the art of looking unconcerned when he wasn't. She had noticed this about him. He was the most readable of the three, which in a household that ran largely on things unsaid made him valuable. "I wrote them," he said. "The letters you received, the real ones. I mean, they were real. The words in them were Garrett's, the ideas were his, but he couldn't. He'd write a sentence and cross it out and write it again and cross that out too. He'd go through 5 sheets of paper and end up with nothing. I just, I'd sit with him and he'd talk and I'd write what he said and shape it a little. Not change it, just make it something that could be sent." Nell looked at the mountains, which were going purple in the evening light. "And the letters he wrote himself," she said. "The ones in the box." Sawyer was quiet for a moment. "He reads yours," he said finally. "Everyone, 3 times at least. I've seen him sitting by the window with them in the late afternoon." He paused. "He just couldn't send his back the same way. I don't think he thought they were good enough." She thought about the letter where Garrett had described sitting in front of a blank page for an hour. She thought about 11 unsent letters, each one more honest than the last, stacked in a box under a writing desk in a room off the main bedroom. "The man who wrote those letters," she said, "and the man who came across the yard this afternoon are the same person." "Yeah," Sawyer said. "He's just further inside himself in person. Always has been, since before the war. The war made it more so." She nodded slowly. "I'm not angry," she said. "I want you to know that. But I need to know that everything in those letters, the things he said about what he wanted and what he was and what he could offer, that those were true, not performed for effect." "Every word," Sawyer said. There was no hesitation in it. She picked up her inventory notebook and made a note about the late squash and snapped it closed. "Then we'll see," she said. "That's all I'm saying. We'll see." Sawyer nodded. He got off the fence post. He was almost back to the cabin when she spoke again, not looking up from the garden. "He should talk to me himself when he's ready. What he wants to say, he should say himself, not on paper and not through you." There was a pause. Then Sawyer said, "I'll tell him." The mountains went from purple to black. The first stars appeared over the eastern ridge, coming out one at a time the way stars do in high country, not all at once, but in a slow accumulation that eventually became something you could not look away from. She stood in the garden for a while after Sawyer went in with the notebook in her hand and the smell of pine and cold water coming off the high slopes, and thought that the distance between who a person was and who they appeared to be was sometimes the most interesting country you'd ever walk through. 3 miles from the ranch, on a low outcropping of stone above the western tree line, a man lay on his stomach in the dark and watched the lights in the cabin below through a spyglass. His name was Rex Hargrove. He was 42 years old and looked older, not from weakness, but from the particular aging that happens to a man who has been carrying something heavy for too long. His hair was iron gray, his face deeply lined the skin of someone who had spent decades at altitude. His eyes were dark brown and mostly unreadable, which was not indifference but its opposite. The things he felt all the way down, and he had learned a long time ago that showing that to people gave them information they could use against you. The man beside him, Decker, was 23 and had the air of someone who had followed his way into a situation he was not entirely certain he belonged in. He was good at his job, or had been good at the previous jobs, and he was loyal in the way of young men who have not yet had loyalty cost them too much, and he was watching his employer watch the cabin below with an expression that Decker had learned in the months since he had hired on to be cautious about. "She arrived this week," Hargrove said, without lowering the glass. "The bride," Decker said. "Mail order." Decker watched the lights in the cabin. "What are we waiting for?" Hargrove was quiet for a long moment. When he lowered the spyglass, he didn't look at Decker. He looked at the lights. "Calloway killed my brother," he said. "Caught him running horses he didn't own, and shot him when he reached for his gun. Everyone said it was justified. Everyone said Jimmy was in the wrong." A pause. Everyone was probably right. Decker said nothing. But he was my brother, Hargrove said, and I'm the only one left who's going to do anything about that. He folded the spyglass closed with the care of someone handling something that still had value. The girl is how we do it. Calloway's that kind of man. The kind that gets attached to things, that makes him predictable. Decker looked at the lights. We just going to take her. When the time is right, not yet. There are 3 of them, and I want the eldest alone when we do it. Give them a week. Let her settle in. Let him start thinking she's safe. Hargrove stood up, his joints cracking in the mountain cold with a sound like old wood. Men like Calloway, once something's theirs, they'll do anything to protect it. He started back down through the trees. Decker followed, and as he went, he thought not for the first time about asking how Hargrove knew the girl was Calloway's kind of thing to protect, if she'd only arrived that week. He didn't ask. He had learned when not to ask. Behind them, the lights in the cabin below stayed steady and warm. 4 small squares of yellow against the enormous dark of the mountains, and above them both the Colorado sky poured out its extravagance of stars, cold and indifferent and beautiful the way the country up here was beautiful, which was without any particular concern for the people moving around at the bottom of it. That night after supper, after Sawyer had gone to his room and Cole had gone out to check the stock one last time, Garrett Calloway sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of him and a blank piece of paper in front of that. He had been sitting there for 20 minutes. Nell came out of her room for water and saw him at the table. She filled her cup at the pail and turned to go back and then stopped. The chapter on the San Juan Range is very good, she said. He looked up. The one in the plant book. You were right about it. He nodded. He looked at the blank paper. He looked at her. I'm not good at starting conversations, he said. I want you to know that I know that. I know, she said. I'm better in letters. I've been told I'm better in letters. She looked at him for a moment, this large, quiet man sitting at a kitchen table in the light of a kerosene lamp, his hands flat on either side of a piece of blank paper trying. She thought about 11 letters in a wooden box. She thought about dried wildflowers in a jar on a table in a small, clean room. You don't have to be better in letters, she said. You can just talk to me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I marked the chapter. The one about the plants that grow above the tree line, the pages folded. I'll look for it, she said. She went back to her room. She could hear him at the table for a while after that, the small sounds of a man staying still, and then the sound of a chair and footsteps and the lamp going out. She lay in the dark with the natural history open on the bed beside her, and the mountains outside her window invisible, but present, enormous, and patient, and thought that some distances were crossed in big gestures and some in small ones, and the small ones were usually the kind that lasted. Outside, 3 miles up the ridge, a fire burned low and then went out. 2 men slept under canvas. One of them did not sleep well. Down at the ranch in the main bedroom, a man lay awake for a long time looking at the ceiling. In the room at the end of the hall, a woman slept with her mother's medicine chest on the table beside her, and a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon on the shelf above it, and the sound of high country wind in the pines coming through her window like something the mountains were trying to say. 7 days later, she would go to gather plants at the eastern draw and would not come back before supper. But that is another part of the story. For now, it is still the early days. The days when everything is still possibility and nothing is yet decided, and the mountains are simply there, as they have always been watching, without judgment, holding the valley in their old stone hands, waiting to see what the people at the bottom of them will make of the time they have been given. A man keeps his word. She was beginning to understand what that meant out here, where the winters came hard and the distances were real, and the things you promised had weight because there was nothing soft to catch them when they fell. She was beginning to understand what kind of man she had come to find. And in the cold room on the mountain weeks later, sitting with her back against the stone and the stars in the narrow window above her head, she would remember these early days the way you remember the calm before something difficult, not with sadness, but with the particular tenderness you feel for the time before you understood what was at stake. She had understood what was at stake. She had stayed anyway. The mountain had chosen her. She had chosen it back. The morning of the 12th day began like the others. The fire, the coffee, The particular quality of mountain light that came through the east-facing windows of the Callaway cabin in the early hours, not gentle exactly, but honest, laying everything bare without ceremony. Nell had come to appreciate that about the high country. It did not soften what it illuminated. It simply showed you what was there. She had been at the ranch for nearly 2 weeks. She had learned the rhythms of the place, the way you learn the rhythms of any living thing, by watching, and then by doing, and then by the gradual accumulation of small competencies that together began to feel like belonging. She knew which floorboard in the hall announced footsteps at any hour. She knew that Cole took his coffee black and that Sawyer took his with molasses when he thought nobody was watching, and that Garrett drank his standing at the window for the first 10 minutes of every morning, not looking at anything in particular, or perhaps looking at everything at once. She knew that the kitchen garden needed attention at the south end, where the late squash had sprawled beyond its intended boundaries. She knew that the big bay mare in the near corral was sound again, the inflammation in the fetlock responding to the poultice in 4 days, as she had said it would, and that Cole had noticed this and said nothing about it, but had the following morning left a fresh supply of firewood at her room door, without explanation. She knew, too, that the medicine chest on her table was running low on goldenrod. She had been watching the level for 3 days and calculating against what she was likely to need through the autumn, and what she had concluded was that she needed to walk to the eastern draw where she had seen the plant growing in abundance on her 3rd day at the ranch. The draw was close a quarter-mile from the cabin at most. She could see the tree line from the yard. Cole had told her the first week not to go out alone. She remembered this. She weighed it against the dwindling goldenrod, and Cole's chapped hand, where a rope burn from 2 days ago was showing the first signs of inflammation she didn't like. And she made a decision that she would later understand was the only mistake she made in the whole of that difficult autumn. She told herself she would be an hour. She left before Garrett came back from checking the northern fence. She left before Cole returned from the eastern pasture. She left while Sawyer was in the barn with a horse that had been favoring its off forelegs since Tuesday. She took her gathering bag and her small knife in the medicine chest key on its cord around her neck, and she went out the kitchen door in the clear September morning and walked east toward the draw. She was perhaps 100 yards into the trees when she found the goldenrod. It was growing the way it often did in mountain draws in dense stands between the rocks, still carrying its late-season blooms, and she knelt down and began to work with the methodical care her mother had taught her, cutting the flowering heads cleanly and laying them in the bag without crushing. She worked for perhaps 20 minutes in the silence of the pines, which was not silence at all, but a layered complexity of wind and birdsong, and the distant sound of water somewhere below on the slope. She did not hear the horses. She heard almost nothing, which is to say she heard a change in the quality of the air around her before she heard any specific sound, the particular way the birds stop when something larger than expected has moved into the space they thought was theirs. She started to straighten. The shadow fell across her before she could. There were 3 of them. She understood this very quickly. Even in the first seconds of confusion, processing the geometry of the situation, with the part of her mind that her mother had spent years sharpening, the part that counted and calculated before the rest of the mind had caught up with fear. 3 men, 3 horses. She could hear the others now, one directly behind her, one to the left, one coming around the right, cutting off the open ground between her and the tree line. She ran anyway. That was instinct, not calculation, and it got her 10 steps before the one on the right closed the gap, and she understood that running was no longer a productive option. But those 10 steps gave her something. In the first 3, she got her hand to the hem of her skirt and tore. The fabric was good wool, and it did not tear easily, and the sound of it was louder than she wanted. But she had the piece in her hand before they reached her, and she dropped it as she was caught, letting it fall in the sparse grass between 2 rocks where the ground was soft enough to hold a boot print. They took the gathering bag. They did not find the medicine chest key. They did not find the small knife which she slid into the cuff of her boot in the half-second of confusion when the man on her left tried to manage the reins of 2 horses at once and looked away. She marked everything she could. The direction they moved northwest, climbing immediately. The condition of the horses, well-fed but not trail-hard, they were laboring on the slope within the first half-mile. The 3 men themselves, the one in front, older, iron-haired, the quality of control in his posture that suggested authority rather than just size. The youngest behind her, who held his reins too tight, and whose eyes moved more than the others. And the third Wade riding to her left with his left leg extended in the stirrup at an angle that said he was managing pain somewhere in that knee or below. Every 10 minutes she found a way. A strip of her skirt hem torn small, the blue ribbon from the letters which she had tucked into her pocket that morning for no reason she could explain, and which she now understood as something her hands had known before her mind did. A button from her cuff, two strips of ribbon, three more pieces of hem, a small length of thread, 8 markers on the trail between the eastern draw and wherever they were taking her. She counted them as she left them and held the number in her mind like a lamp. The fortress, which was not quite what you would call a fortress if you were being precise, but which was the most defensible structure she had seen in the high country, occupied a shelf of rock behind 3 large boulders on the north face of what her sense of direction told her was the western ridge above the Callaway pastures. It was built of logs and stone and had the particular solidity of something constructed by people who expected to need it. Inside it was darker than outside and smelled of wood smoke and unwashed wool and the mineral sharpness of high-altitude cold. The room they put her in was small, sewn on 3 sides, log on the 4th, a window above her head, too narrow to get through and too high to reach without something to stand on. A plank door thick with a heavy drop bar on the outside. They did not tie her hands. She noted this. Either they had assessed her correctly as unable to escape through the physical constraints of the room, or they had not thought it through completely. The latter seemed unlikely given the quality of the older man's attention. She chose to believe the former and to see if she could prove them wrong in a way they would not expect. She sat down on the floor with her back against the stone and took inventory, medicine chest key on its cord, small knife in her boot. Her mind, which was working clearly despite the fear, because her mother had taught her that fear was information and panic was what happened when you refused to process it. The door opened after an hour. The iron-haired man came in alone. He sat down on the single 3-legged stool in the room as though he owned it, which technically he did, and he looked at her for a long moment before he said anything. In that moment, she studied him with the same attention she brought to a plant or a wound, reading what was there rather than what she expected to find. What she found was not what she expected. He was not a man performing menace. He was a man who was tired in a way that had gone all the way through him, tired down to something fundamental. And the lines in his face were not only the lines of age and weather, but the lines of someone who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had run out of good reasons to put it down. "You're not going to be harmed," he said. "I want you to know that." "Then why am I here?" she said. "Because Garrett Calloway needs to learn something." He paused. He seemed to be choosing his words with care, not to mislead her, but to be accurate. "My brother ran horses that weren't his. Calloway caught him and gave him a chance to walk away. Jimmy didn't take the chance. Calloway shot him. Every man I've talked to who was there says it was justified." Another pause. "They're probably right." She waited. "But Jimmy was my brother," he said, "and there's nobody left to do anything about that except me." "So I'm leverage," she said. "You're leverage," he confirmed. She looked at his face. She had expected coldness and found grief, instead grief that had curdled into something harder over time, the way things do when they're left without air. And underneath it, something she recognized from the faces of people she had sat with in extremis. The particular look of someone who had lost the central thing that organized their days and had been walking through the wreckage of their own life ever since just walking, because stopping seemed worse. "What was her name?" she said. He went still. "The woman you lost," she said. "Not your brother, the other loss, the one before that." He looked at her for a long time without speaking. The lamp on the shelf between them flickered in a draft from somewhere, and his face moved through shadow and then back into light. "Emily," he said. She said nothing. 12 years ago, the baby too." He stopped. He was looking at her with an expression she could not fully read, something that was recognition and pain in equal measure. "You look like her. The hair, the eyes, the way you hold your chin when you're frightened but trying not to show it." She understood then the particular quality of his attention since they had taken her. Not the attention of a man who wanted something from her, but the attention of a man confronting a wound he had thought was healed and finding it was not. "I'm sorry," she said. "About Emily. About your brother." He stood up. He didn't say anything. He went out and the bar came down on the other side of the door, and she sat alone in the cold room with the stone against her back in the star-filled window above her head. She thought about what she had just learned. Rex Hargrove was not a man driven by cruelty. He was a man driven by grief that had nowhere left to go, grief that had collapsed inward over 12 years and come back out as the only feeling he had left, that still moved him, which was the need to make someone account for his brother's death, because there was nothing else left to account for. He had found a purpose in it. Purposes like that she had seen enough to know were harder to reason with than simple malice because they were held in a part of the self that had already decided it had nothing left to lose. That made him dangerous. It also made him, in some way she could not yet fully articulate, reachable. She filed this away and turned her attention to the more immediate question of the man with the bad leg. The next morning she called through the door. Decker answered. He was younger than she had initially assessed, and when she told him that Wade was going to lose the leg below the knee, if nobody treated the infection that was clearly spreading through the wound, she could see every time he shifted his weight. Decker's face went through several things quickly, and then he went to find Hargrove. Hargrove came and stood in the doorway and looked at her with the expression of a man trying to determine the angle of an offer. "You're a doctor," he said. "My father was a doctor. My mother knew plants. Between them, they taught me most of what a doctor knows about treating wounds in the field." She kept her voice level and practical, the way her mother had kept her voice when negotiating for the material she needed. "If that infection reaches the bone, your man loses the leg. If it spreads past the knee, he loses his life. I can treat it. I need what's in that medicine chest." "Why would you help us?" he said. "Because I cannot watch a man come to harm through inaction when I have the means to prevent it," she said. "That's not a virtue, it's a limitation. My mother had it too." He was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the door and stepped back, and she walked out into the main room, where Wade was sitting by the fire with his left boot off and the look on his face of a man who had been pretending for days that something was not as bad as it was. She was given back her medicine chest and a canteen of water and a pot to heat it in, and she worked while Decker watched, and Hargrove stood in the corner and said nothing. She cleaned the wound, which was a deep rope burn on the shin that had been improperly treated and had gone to inflammation and early infection in the way such things did in mountain conditions. She applied the poultice and dressed it properly and told Wade to keep it elevated and to not put weight on it for 2 days. And when she was done, Wade looked at her with the expression of a man who has just realized that the situation is more complicated than he had been told. She also, in the process of working, learned the dimensions of the room. The distance from the north wall to the main door, the position of the bar on the main door visible in the gap when someone came in or went out, the height of the windows, none of which would serve a grown person's escape, the rotation of the 2 men on outside watch, which she deduced from the sounds of footsteps and the timing of the changes in light under the door, and the north door, narrow, low, set into the wall behind the woodpile, a door that was used infrequently. She could tell by the dust on the threshold, probably a secondary exit or a remnant from the original construction of the building. The bar on it was heavy timber, but fitted loosely in its brackets, the kind of fit that happened when wood warped over seasons. She committed all of this to the same part of her mind that held the 8 trail markers, the counting part, the part her mother had trained to never stop working, regardless of what the rest of her was feeling. Then she let them take her back to the stone room. This time they were less careless with her. The bar dropped on the door, and then, after a moment's deliberation, she heard through the wood the door opened again, and Decker came in and gagged her without meeting her eyes. She supposed she had been too useful to entirely trust. She sat with her back against the wall and watched the stars appear in the narrow window above her head, and thought about Garrett Calloway standing at his kitchen window in the early morning with a cup of coffee gone cold, and the dried flowers in the jar on her table, and 11 unsent letters in a wooden box, and a man who had said, "I wanted someone to sit across the table from." She thought about a man who had once moved through the dark of Virginia in bare feet so that the ground could tell him what his eyes could not. She thought, he is coming. Not because she was certain. She had no certainty. She had a week and a half of watching a man who said almost nothing and did everything he said he would do, who had cleaned a window and laundered a curtain, and found dried flowers before a stranger arrived at his door, who had written 11 letters he could not send because the words were true and the truth mattered to him more than the appearance of confidence. She thought he is coming, and when he comes, I need to be ready to be still. That was the hardest part. Not the fear, not the cold, not the hours of sitting on stone with her back aching and her wrists raw. The hardest part was the discipline of stillness when everything in her wanted to act. She was her mother's daughter. She had always acted. Inaction felt like surrender. But this was not inaction. This was a different kind of work. The work of trusting someone else's competence the way she trusted her own. She was still working on it when the stars moved to their deepest position in the window and the camp outside went quiet. At the Callaway Ranch, Garrett came back from the northern fence at midday and walked through a house that was not right. He could not have said immediately what was wrong. It was the kind of knowledge that came from years of reading a space, knowing what it sounded like when things were in their proper order and what it sounded like when they were not. The kitchen was right. The smell of the morning's coffee was still in the air. Her medicine chest was gone from the table, which could have meant she had taken it with her for a reason. He went to the barn. Sawyer was there, still working the four-leg horse, and turned when Garrett came in. "No," Garrett said. Sawyer looked up. Something in Garrett's face made him put down the hoof pick. They found Cole at the eastern pasture gate. They did not need to explain much. Cole looked at Garrett's face the same way Sawyer had and immediately began to organize himself for movement. They went east together, spreading out as they approached the draw, and Garrett found the first marker within 50 feet of the tree line. A piece of dark wool, indigo blue, folded twice as if placed deliberately rather than dropped in haste. He held it in his hand for a moment. He thought about a woman who had come to a strange place carrying a medicine chest, and her mother's knowledge who had noticed on the third day that a horse was in pain and had done something about it without being asked who had said that the mountains were oppressive. The good way, the way that reminded you the world was bigger than your troubles. He thought about 11 letters in a box under a desk that he had never been able to send because the words were his and the truth was his, and he did not know how to send himself anywhere. He found the second marker 20 yards further along the trail, the third at the first switchback, and after that the trail was clear enough to follow without markers. But the markers kept appearing regular as heartbeats every 10 minutes of trail time. 8 in total. He counted them as he found them, the way he imagined she had counted them as she left them. Cole studied the horse sign where it left the draw. 3 animals unshod on the near left shod, with iron on the others. "Hargrove," he said. "Yes," Garrett said. They stood in the afternoon light at the edge of the trail going northwest into the steep country, and Sawyer said, "How long before dark?" 4 hours, Garrett said. "Maybe 5. "We need them to settle," Cole said. "Yes," Garrett said again. He was looking up the ridge. He had been up that ridge before. He had hunted that country for 15 years, and there was one place on the northwest face above the second boulder field where you could see most of the valley on a clear day, and where if you were a man who needed a defensible position and had the time to build one, you would build. He knew where she was. He turned to his brothers. Cole was watching him with those amber eyes that missed almost nothing, and Sawyer was watching him with an expression that was trying not to be afraid and not fully succeeding. "I go in from the north," Garrett said. "Old Hunter's trail comes down behind the boulder field. They won't know it." He looked at Cole. "You take the horses to the south draw. Keep them on the south side of the pines so the smell doesn't carry uphill." "Alone," Cole said. It was not quite a question. "2 men make twice the noise," Garrett said. "I've done this before." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Garrett." He waited until his brother looked at him. "I need to say something." "Say it." Cole looked at the ground, then back up. "I've got feelings for her. For Nell. I didn't plan for it, and I'm not going to do anything about it. But you should know. Before you go in there, you should know it's not only your stake in this." Garrett held his brother's gaze for 3 full seconds. "I know," he said. "I've seen it." Cole nodded once. Whatever else was in the nod, it contained the whole of the conversation. "She's the one who chooses," Garrett said. "Not either of us." "I know that too," Cole said. He said it the way a man says something he has already made his peace with, clear and final and without residue. Sawyer looked between his brothers with the expression of someone watching something very old and very deep, the way a river is old and deep move between 2 banks that have always held it. He said nothing. They split up at the base of the ridge. The old hunter's trail was not really a trail anymore. It had been a game path once used by elk and deer and the mountain men who followed them. And it had not been maintained in decades, and the mountain had been working at it all that time, pushing rock over the edges and growing brush across the middle, and generally reclaiming it in the patient way that high country reclaims everything eventually. Garrett moved through it in the dark. He had left his boots at the base of the ridge. The stone was cold under his feet and sharp in places, and he moved through the memory of other dark, other stone, other times when silence was not a preference, but a condition of surviving the night. The body remembered what the mind was sometimes slow to recall. He moved the way he had moved in Virginia and Tennessee in the light-boned, ugly middle years of the war when the work of a scout was to be exactly where nobody expected him and to carry back exactly what was needed, and to do both of these things without leaving any evidence that he had been there at all. He stopped every 20 steps and listened. He let his eyes work the dark the way eyes do when you give them time, finding depth and shape in what first seemed absolute. Above him, the stars were doing the thing they did up here, filling every inch of available sky with cold light, and by that light he could read the rock well enough to place each foot before he moved. An hour up the trail, he heard the camp, not voices. The more sounds of a place where people are trying to sleep, the shift of someone on hard ground, a horse moving in its picket, the particular settling creak of timber that has been warm all day and is cooling now in the mountain night. He stopped and counted the sounds. One guard on the east face. He could hear the soft, irregular crunch of footsteps on frost-rimmed rock, stopping, moving, stopping again in the pattern of a man who was fighting boredom and cold with movement. The pattern was uneven, which meant the man was tired or distracted, or both. No sound from the north. He moved to the north wall of the building with the patience of a man who understood that patience was not the absence of urgency, but the correct application of it. Each step placed before the weight followed each pause, held until the silence was complete again. The wall was log on the lower section and stone above, and it was cold against his hands when he pressed himself flat against it and listened to the inside. Breathing, the slow, deep breathing of men who had done hard physical work and eaten and drunk and let the fire die down and were sleeping the way working men sleep fully and without apology. He moved along the wall to the window. It was small, perhaps 18 inches across and a foot high, set high in the stone, the kind of window that was designed for light and air and not for entry. He reached up and ran his fingers along the frame. Old iron hinges, surface rusted, the kind of rust that happened over years, rather than neglect, the kind that was more appearance than depth. He tested each hinge before he moved it. The first was stiff and required a slow, steady pressure, not force exactly, but persistence, and it gave after a long moment with a sound no louder than the settling of timber. The second was better. The third, the lowest, had been wet at some point, and the rust was true, and he held his breath when he worked it, but the darkness inside the building swallowed the small sound it made. He looked through. In the dark of the room below, he could see the shape of her, and then as his eyes finished their adjustment, he could see her watching him. She had not moved when the window opened. She was sitting with her back against the far wall, exactly as he had imagined her, alert and still, and her face in the faint starlight coming through the window was the face of someone who had been waiting with intention rather than fear. He held one finger to his lips. She nodded. One nod, deliberate and complete. He reached through with his arm, feeling the edge of the window frame against his shoulder, and she understood immediately what he needed and got to her feet and came to stand beneath him. And when his hand found her bound wrists, she held them steady and did not flinch when the knife came down. The rope was good hemp, and his knife was sharp, and it took less than 3 seconds. She caught the pieces before they hit the floor. He reached to her face and found the cloth they had used to gag her and worked the knot at the back of her head with his fingers, and when it came free, she opened her jaw slowly and silently and breathed through her nose. He pointed down at her feet. She sat and he cut the ankle rope 2 pieces and she held those 2. He pulled himself up and over the window frame. It was a tight fit and he took it slow, his shoulders clearing the frame by perhaps 2 inches on each side, and he came down inside the room feet first and landed without sound because the floor was packed earth under the stone, and packed earth is forgiving. She was already standing. He did not carry her the way you carry someone who cannot manage themselves. He put his arm around her waist and she put her arm around his shoulders, and they moved together to the window, and she was steady on her feet despite the hours of cold and the constraint steadier than he expected, and perhaps steadier than she had expected herself. Getting her out through the window was the part that required the most patience. She had to go sideways, right shoulder first, head turned, her free arm extended through ahead of her, and he had to both support her weight and guide her body through the frame without either of them making a sound that the sleeping building would hear. They did it in stages, half an inch at a time, Garrett outside the wall by then, and holding her, taking her weight through the frame. When she was out, he set her on her feet against the wall, and they stood for a moment with their shoulders touching and the cold of the mountain air coming at them and the stars overhead and the sleeping camp on the other side of the logs. He pointed south. She nodded. They moved along the wall to the corner. He checked the east face, and the guard was still on the far side, footsteps continuing their insomniac patrol. The south was open ground to the tree line, 60 yards of open frost-covered grass that would show two people moving across it clearly to anyone watching. But there was nobody watching the south, not tonight, not yet. They moved across it, not running. Fast walking each step placed the kind of movement that minimized both sound and visual profile, and beside him she matched his pace without prompting, her arms still around his waist, because the ground was uneven and her feet were numb from the cold floor, and he could feel her compensating for the numbness with each step. They were 40 yards from the tree line when the voice came from behind them. It was not a shout. It was the voice of a man who had woken from a half-sleep for no clear reason and spoken before he was fully conscious of why, and then in the next half-second became conscious of exactly why. She's gone. The woman, she's not in the room. And then it was a shout. Garrett said one word: run. She ran. He ran beside her, and the tree line came at them, and they went into it, and the dark closed around them, and the noise behind them was rising voices and boots on stone, and the whinny of horses startled awake, but the dark and the trees were theirs now. This was the country Garrett knew in his bones, and he went through it at a pace that most men would not have managed in daylight. She kept up. Her hand found his in the dark, and he held it, and they moved through the pines together, and below them, and to the south the horses were waiting. Cole heard them before he saw them. He was up and had the horses ready, all four of them, by the time Garrett came through the last of the pines with Nell beside him and the sound of pursuit still climbing the south slope behind. They were mounted and moving within seconds. Garrett set a pace that climbed west and north into the steep country where the horses of men who did not know this land would not follow, and the noise of pursuit faded first to occasional shouts and then to nothing at all, the mountains swallowing it the way the mountains swallowed everything eventually. Sawyer, riding behind, said nothing for a long time. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "Winter always ends." Nobody answered, but Nell, riding beside Garrett with her borrowed horse finding its footing in the dark, reached up and pushed a strand of hair out of her face and looked at the stars over the high ridge ahead and breathed. Garrett's high country cabin was 3 more hours of riding, climbing all the way. They arrived in the gray pre-dawn hour when the eastern sky was just beginning to separate itself from the rest of the dark, the mountains taking on their first faint outlines against the lightning east. The cabin was built into the hillside and built well, logs and stone again, but higher up and smaller and tighter, the kind of structure that was designed to hold heat against a winter that came early and stayed late. Inside a banked fire, the smell of pine resin and old coffee, and the particular cold of a place that had been empty for days. Garrett carried her in, not because she could not walk, she had told him twice on the last mile that she was capable of walking, but because her feet were still numb from the stone floor of the fortress room, and the ground here was uneven, and he had his arm around her anyway. He set her down on the bed, which was the only bed, and she sat on the edge of it and looked at her hands for a moment. "Let me see your wrists," he said. "Let me see your feet," she said. He looked down at his bare feet, which were in the condition you would expect of feet that had climbed a mountain face over frost-rimed rock in the dark. She looked at them too. "Sit down," she said. He sat in the chair by the fire. She opened her medicine chest on the table beside her, which Cole had brought in, and she cleaned and dressed the cuts on his feet with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this work their whole life. And he held still and let her work the way he had held still in the fortress room when she had held out her bound wrists. The man with the bad leg, she said while she worked. Wade, I treated the wound yesterday. If someone continues the treatment, he'll keep the leg. I'll see that someone does, Garrett said. She nodded. She worked for a moment in silence. Then she said, Hargrove told me about your brother, about Jimmy. It was justified, Garrett said. He drew first. I know, she said. He told me that too. She glanced up at him. He knows it was justified. That doesn't seem to make it easier. Garrett was quiet. He had a wife, she said. Emily, she dated 12 years ago. A baby that didn't survive either. She returned her attention to the work. He's been carrying all of it for a long time. The grief and the anger together, and the anger is easier to carry because grief doesn't give you anywhere to go. Garrett looked at the fire. This doesn't end here, he said. Men like Hargrove don't stop. As long as he's in these mountains, you're not safe. Cole isn't safe. Sawyer. I know, she said. I need to go back out tonight. I know where they'll camp. There's only one good position with water between here and where they are now. I know the ground. I can do what needs to be done. She finished with his feet and sat back. She looked at him directly the way she had looked at him across the kitchen table in the early mornings, with the full weight of her attention. You'll offer them a chance to leave, she said. I'll offer them a chance, he said. What they do with it is their decision. She stood up. She crossed the room and stood in front of him, and she placed her hand flat on his chest over the left side. Come back, she said. That's all I'm asking. Come back. He put his hand over hers. The warmth of it was the warmth of the fire behind him and the warmth of the hand itself, and she could feel his heartbeat under her palms, steady and slow. I keep my word, he said. She did not argue. She did not try to talk him out of it or offer alternatives or tell him to be careful, because she had been watching him for 2 weeks and she understood that being careful was not separate from what he did. It was the same thing. She moved back and sat down on the edge of the bed, and he went out and the door closed behind him, and she listened to the sound of one horse moving away north into the dark. Sawyer was asleep in the corner on a bedroll. Cole sat by the fire and did not sleep. She did not sleep either. They sat in the quiet of the cabin in the dark, and the wind came off the high peaks and pressed against the walls with the patient insistence of something that would still be here long after all of them were done with their business. She thought about dried flowers in a jar. She thought about 11 letters in a wooden box. She thought about a man who wrote the same signature twice and crossed it out both times because he was not sure he had earned it. She thought about patience and about the different kinds of work it asked of you. He came back in the first real light of morning. She heard the horse before she saw him, and she was at the door before the sound had fully resolved into identifiable information, and when he came around the near pine, she saw immediately that something was wrong. He was riding upright, but there was a quality to the uprightness that was effortful rather than natural, the posture of a man maintaining form by decision rather than ease. She went down the steps. I'm all right, he said before she reached him. You are not all right, she said. She caught his arm as he dismounted, and he came down harder than he would have chosen. And when she got his coat open, she saw the dark staining along his right side, a graze along the lower ribs that had bled freely. Not through to the cavity, not life-threatening, but it needed attention immediately, and it would take time to heal properly. And it hurt in the deep, persistent way of rib injuries. She knew that from her father's practice. She got him inside. Cole took the horse without being asked. She sat Garrett down at the table and opened the medicine chest and worked quickly and thoroughly, cleaning the wound and assessing it and packing it properly against further bleeding and wrapping the ribs. He held still throughout his jaw, set his eyes on the window. Hargrove, she said. The other two, he said and stopped. The weight of the night was on him differently than she had expected. Not the clean weight of a thing finished, but something more complicated. Wade and Decker. They're done. A long pause. Hargrove drew first. I shot him. He went down in the dark. He pressed his hand against the bandaging at his ribs. The shot caught me before I could confirm it. I had to move or I wasn't coming back at all. I left without knowing for certain what I'd left behind. She tied off the bandaging and pressed her hand flat over the dressing, feeling for seep. You're telling me because you want me to understand, she said. Yes. I do understand, she said. Those were not good men making bad choices. They were men who had already made their choices and were committed to them. He looked at her for a long moment. Most people don't see it that way, he said. Most people haven't sat in a cold stone room or 16 hours reading a man's face and learning what's gone wrong inside him, she said. Hargrove made his choices a long time ago. The grief was real, but there were other things he could have done with it. Garrett said nothing. She could see the weight of the night on him, not guilt exactly, but the particular heaviness of a man who has done a hard thing and carried uncertainty home along with everything else. She pulled her chair close to his and sat down. She put her hand on his forearm on the old rope-burn scar she had noticed on the first day and left it there. Rest, she said. Whatever else needs to be said can be said after you've slept. He looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at her face. Nell, he said. Her name in his mouth had the quality of something he had been practicing, something he had wanted to say in a particular tone for longer than was casual. I know, she said. Me too. We'll do it properly later when you're not bleeding. He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she had seen across the kitchen table, the one that went further in the eyes than in the face. She got him to the bed and he lay down and was asleep inside 3 minutes, the deep, immediate sleep of exhaustion. And she sat in the chair by the fire and listened to him breathe and watched the light change on the mountain outside the window. She thought it is over. She thought we can go home. Somewhere in the high country, 3 miles north and still in the dark of the boulder field, something was not quite as concluded as she believed. But she did not know that yet. In that moment, in the first clean light of the Colorado morning, with the smell of pine resin and wood smoke, and the man she had come a very long way to find breathing slowly in the next room, she knew only that she was still here and he had come back, and the mountains outside were enormous and patient, and had been here before either of them and would be here long after. She thought the mountain chose you. She looked out at the high peaks, catching the first light, going from gray to rose, to the particular gold that only the high country managed, and she thought, I know. I chose it back. He slept for 11 hours. Nell knew this because she did not sleep at all. She sat in the chair by the fire with the natural history of mountain plants open on her lap, reading the same page 3 times without taking in the words, listening to the sound of his breathing. In the other room, steady and deep, and occasionally catching in the way of a man sleeping through pain he has decided to ignore. The wound along his ribs was not dangerous. She had assessed it thoroughly enough to be certain of this. But ribs were slow to heal and easy to re-injure, and she intended to say so clearly when he woke up, because he was the kind of man who would consider himself operational long before his body had finished arguing the point. Cole kept the fire. He moved around the small cabin with the same economy he brought to everything, not wasting motion, not filling the silence with anything unnecessary. At some point in the early morning, he made coffee and set a cup near her elbow without saying anything about it, which was the most considerate thing he could have done under the circumstances. Sawyer slept on the bedroll until just after dawn, then woke and went out to see to the horses, and came back with the look of a man who had been thinking hard in the cold air and had not arrived at anything that made him feel better about it. The Morrison will need to know, Cole said when they were all 3 in the main room and Garrett was still sleeping. He meant the sheriff. He always called him the Morrison, a habit from childhood that nobody had ever successfully corrected. When Garrett wakes up, Nell said, how long should he sleep? As long as he needs to. Cole looked at her. She looked back. He nodded and poured himself more coffee, and that was the end of that particular negotiation. Garrett woke at mid-morning and came out of the back room, moving carefully, his right hand pressed to his ribs in the unconscious way of a man managing pain through positioning. He looked at the 3 of them and then at the coffee on the stove and went to pour himself a cup. Mancos, he said, today. Tomorrow, Nell said. He turned and looked at her. She looked back at him with the same steadiness she had used on Cole, the same steadiness she had used in the cold room on the mountain and on the trail coming down and through the long night before. He read it the way he read everything, carefully and completely. Tomorrow, he said. They spent one more night at the high cabin. Sawyer cooked, which he did well, and seemed to find genuinely satisfying in a way that he was mildly embarrassed about, filling the small space with the smell of venison and dried herbs and biscuits that came out better than had any right to at this altitude. Nell changed the dressing on Garrett's ribs and told him clearly what she expected of him over the next 2 weeks, which was more rest than he was going to find acceptable and considerably less lifting and chopping than his current plans apparently included. He listened without interrupting, which she was coming to understand was his form of agreement. That evening they sat around the fire, all four of them, and the silence that had always been the dominant language of the Calloway household was present, but different in character. It had room in it now for something that had not been there before. Not ease exactly, not yet, but the beginning of ease, the first loosening of a thing that has been held rigid for too long. Nell looked at Garrett's profile in the firelight, the strong line of jaw and brow, the quality of stillness that was not blankness but depth, and she thought about the letter where he had written that he had never found adequate words for the way the light changed on the high peaks in the evening. She thought she understood now what he had been trying to say. Not that the beauty was beyond language, that it was simply better experienced than described, and that some things required a witness to be complete. Outside, the wind moved through the high pines. The fire settled. The mountains held them in their cupped hands the way they always had and always would. They came down to Mancos on a bright October morning, the aspen already turning on the lower slopes. Whole hillsides of gold and amber laid out against the gray stone above, and the town itself small and weathered and permanent looking, in the way of frontier settlements that had survived long enough to stop being surprised by difficulty. Sheriff Morrison was a man of 60 who moved like a younger man and spoke like a man who had learned that most problems resolved themselves if you gave them enough time, but that some problems required immediate and definitive attention, and that the skill was in knowing which was which. He had known Garrett Calloway for 15 years. He stood behind his desk and listened to the full account without interrupting, and when it was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "Hargrove," he said. "Yes," Garrett said. "His men." Two of them confirmed. "Hargrove, I hit him in the dark before I took the graze. I left before first light. I couldn't verify." Morrison held this information carefully the way a man holds something fragile and consequential at the same time. He turned to his deputy, a young man named Fitch, who was writing everything down with the concentration of someone who understood this was a document that mattered. "Put it on paper. Justified defense, attempted kidnapping, existing warrants." He turned back to Garrett. "Hargrove had paper on him from 3 counties. Whatever we find up there closes that file." He said this the way men in his position said things that were the legal and factual truth and also simultaneously incomplete. Nell understood this before Morrison said what came next. "There's one thing," he said. He looked at her rather than Garrett when he said it, which told her he had already assessed the situation correctly and was trying to prepare her. "My men went up to that boulder field this morning. Based on what you told me, I sent them early." He paused. The 2 men were there. Not Hargrove. But the room was quiet. "Decker," Morrison said, "the young one, he woke in the night, cut Hargrove loose before sunup. Tracks led northeast. We lost them at the creek crossing." Nell sat very still. "He's gone," she said. "For now," Morrison said. "He's wanted in 3 territories. He shows his face anywhere with a telegraph line, we'll hear about it. But right now," he spread his hands on the desk. "He'll come back," Cole said from the corner of the room. He said it the way he said most things, as an assessment of fact rather than a prediction. "Maybe," Morrison said, "or maybe he does the arithmetic and decides the cost is too high. Men like Hargrove, when you take out their purpose, sometimes they just—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Garrett was looking at the floor. Not in defeat, she could read him well enough to know the difference now, but in the focused way of a man recalculating, adding new information to an existing picture and adjusting what it meant. She put her hand on his forearm on the rope burn scar, the way she had done in the high cabin. "We go on," she said. He looked at her. "We go on," she said again. "Hargrove made his choices. We make ours." Garrett held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to Morrison. "I'll be watching," he said. "If he comes back to different circumstances than he expects." Morrison nodded. He had the expression of a man who believed this entirely and was relieved that someone capable of following through on it was in a position to do so. Outside on the street in the October sun, Cole stood beside Nell while Garrett went to deal with the horses and Sawyer went to find provisions. "I need to say something," Cole said. He said it to the street in front of him rather than to her, which was very much the Cole she had come to know. "Then say it," she said. "I told Garrett. Before we went in that night, I told him what I was feeling. I know, she said. He told me. Cole looked at her, then a quick sideways look that contained some surprise, and then when he processed it fully, something that was not quite relief, but was in the same vicinity. I've made my peace with it, he said. I want you to know that. It's not a thing I'm going to carry around and make everyone manage for me. I didn't think you would, she said. You're too practical for that. He almost smiled. The almost smile ran in the family she was coming to understand. You're going to be a difficult sister-in-law, he said. A lot of opinions. The ranch needs more opinions, she said. I've observed the current situation. This time he did smile. It was brief and not elaborate, but it was real, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face considerably. Good, he said, and that was the end of it. Clean and complete, and without remainder the way Cole Calloway handled everything he decided to handle. Sawyer found her at the dry goods store while she was inventorying her medicine chest against what the Manco store carried. He came and stood beside her and looked at the jars on the shelf, and was quiet for longer than he usually was, which was saying something because Sawyer's default was to fill available silence with available words. The letters, he said. I've been thinking about what I should say about the letters. You don't have to say anything, she said. I think I do, he said. I think I owe you something more specific than just we're sorry. He picked up a ball of dried sage and looked at it. Everything in those letters was true. The words were mine, but the truth was his. The feeling was his. He felt all of it, and he couldn't put it on paper in a way he trusted. And so I did it for him, and I think I believed I was helping, and I also think I was doing it because he stopped. Because you wanted to be part of it, she said not unkindly. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said, something like that. I'm sorry for that part. You know what I think, she said. I think you're the kind of person who loves people fiercely and expresses it in ways that sometimes outrun your judgment. And I think that's a better problem to have than the alternative. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Garrett's lucky, he said. We both are, she said. Now help me figure out if this store carries bone set or if I need to send to Denver for it. He helped her with the inventory, and it was the most comfortable they had been together, efficient and easy, and without the particular weight that the unspoken thing had added to every previous interaction. When they were done, he said he was thinking about riding south in the spring, down toward New Mexico, maybe further. He said it the way a man says something he has been turning over for a while and has finally decided to put out in the air. You'll come back, she said. This is home, he said. But home's a thing you can leave and come back to. That's what makes it home. She thought that was the truest thing he had said to her yet, and she told him so. They arranged the wedding in Mancos. Reverend Aldous was a spare man with a careful manner and a small church that smelled of pine resin and old candle wax and was cold in October, in the particular way of buildings that were heated by effort rather than by design. He listened to what they wanted and said he could have them married by the end of the week, which was not the most romantic phrasing Nell had ever heard, but struck her as honest and reasonable. She bought fabric at the dry goods store. Pale blue wool, fine woven enough for a dress that would be simple and would last and would look exactly like what it was, which was a garment made for a real life in a real place rather than for an occasion that would never come again. She sat in the evenings in the rented room above the general store and sewed by lamplight while the October wind came off the mountains and pressed against the window glass. Garrett came to sit with her sometimes. He did not talk much. He did not need to. He read or worked on small repairs to tack, and the lamp burned between them, and the wind pressed, and the mountains were outside in the dark, the way they were always outside in the dick enormous, and patient and entirely uninterested in the small urgencies of the people at the bottom of them. One night he looked up from the leatherwork and said, I built a bookshelf. She looked up from the sewing. In the high cabin, he said, this spring, I thought there should be more room for books. I didn't know why I thought that at the time. He paused. I know why now. How many shelves, she said. 4. It'll hold a lot. It'll need to, she said. He went back to the leatherwork. She went back to the sewing. After a while, he said without looking up, the room at the end of the hall, at the ranch, it could be made into something useful. A workroom for the medicine, storage for the chest. I'd like that, she said. Cole will build whatever you need built. He does good work with wood. I know, she said. I've seen the barn. He nodded. He went back to the tack. She went back to the blue wool and the needle and the particular quality of silence that was the best silence she had ever been inside. The morning of the wedding was clear and cold. The sky above the mountains the deep October blue that only came when the air had been scoured clean by the first hard frost of the season. The aspens were past their peak now, the gold fading to brown at the edges, a few leaves still turning and releasing in the light wind that came down off the high peaks every morning at this hour. Nell, dressed in the blue wool dress she had made plain at the collar, in the cuffs, and fitting the way something fits when you have made it yourself and know exactly what you are working with. She put her hair up the way her mother had worn her hair, pinned at the back with the good pins she had carried from Boston, and she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and saw a woman who was exactly where she had decided to be, which was the best thing she could say about any moment. Cole was waiting outside the church with Garrett, both of them in their best clothes, which in Cole's case meant a dark coat that fit him well, and in Garrett's case meant a coat that had been brushed and pressed, and a collar that had been ironed flat, and a cravat that was tied slightly wrong, and that Nell straightened when she came up the steps without making a production of it. Sawyer was waiting at the door to escort her in. He had combed his hair, which was an occasion. He offered his arm with the solemnity of someone performing an important function and doing it with intention. "Ready," he said. It was not quite a question. More than she said. The church held a dozen people, the population of the social world the Callaway Ranch maintained. Morrison and his wife, a woman named Bess, who had the handshake of someone who had spent 40 years making things happen. Oldest Prentice from the Eastern Flats, who turned out to be better company in a church than allegedly at a table. A woman named Mrs. Fisk, who had brought a small cake wrapped in cloth and who seemed to feel very strongly about the importance of cake at weddings, with which Nell found herself in complete agreement. Reverend Aldous stood at the front with the manner of a man who had done this many times and found it worth doing every time. Sawyer brought her up the aisle. Garrett turned when he heard her coming, and the thing that happened in his face when he turned was not performed and was not contained and was nothing like the face he brought to the kitchen table in the early mornings or the yard in the afternoon. It was the face underneath those faces, the one that 11 unsent letters had been trying to describe. And she looked at it for a long moment and then looked back at the front of the church so she could keep walking without losing her footing. Sawyer put her hand in Garrett's and stepped back. Reverend Aldous cleared his throat. He began, "We are gathered here today to witness the joining of." The back door of the church opened, not with violence, not with the sound of something forced. It opened the way doors open when someone turns a handle and applies the ordinary pressure of walking through, and the ordinary sound of it in that particular moment was worse than a slam would have been because it took several seconds longer to understand what it meant. Rex Hargrove walked in from the October morning. He had Decker behind him, just the two of them. Hargrove had a pistol in his right hand held low, not pointed at any specific person, but present in the way that a drawn weapon is always pointed at everyone in the room. His face was worse than it had been in the stone fortress. Whatever journey he had been on in the days since Decker cut him loose had not improved his condition. He looked like a man who had been arguing with himself for a very long time and had run out of arguments but had not yet run out of momentum. There was blood dried at his collar from the wound Garrett's shot had opened, poorly dressed and only half healed, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of a man managing pain he has decided is irrelevant. The church went completely still. Morrison in the front pew did not reach for his weapon. He was a man who understood the geometry of the 12 people in an enclosed space and what happened to geometry when firearms entered it. Cole beside Garrett was still in the way of a man calculating. Garrett had turned when the door opened and was standing between Hargrove and Nell with the particular quality of stillness that was not paralysis but readiness, the stillness of a man who has been in many situations that required this and knows that the stillness itself is often the most useful thing. Hargrove looked at him across the length of the small church. "I told you this wasn't finished," he said. What happened next was not what any of them expected, including, it appeared, Rex Hargrove. Nell stepped around Garrett. He put his hand out, instinct, and she took it for a moment, not to be stopped, but in acknowledgement the way you touch someone when you need them to understand something without words, and then she stepped past and went up the aisle. She walked the way she had walked in the Eastern draw when she was approaching a horse in pain, steadily, without haste, watching everything but performing nothing. She stopped 8 feet from Hargrove, close enough to see his face clearly, far enough that he had no immediate reason to feel crowded. "You came back," she said. He looked at her. The gun was still low. His eyes were doing the thing she had first seen in the stone room, the complicated, painful thing of a man confronting a face that was not the face in front of him. "I had to," he said. The aggression was still in his voice, but it was thinner than it had been, stretched over something that was shaking underneath. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about why." He said nothing. "You had Emily for 6 years," she said, "and then you had the grief for 12. And somewhere in those 12 years, the grief stopped being grief and started being the only way you knew how to still feel connected to her. And when Garrett did what he had to do about Jimmy, it gave the grief somewhere to go, something to push against, a direction to move in. And now here you are, and I think you know as well as I do that this—" She gestured a small movement that encompassed the gun and Decker and the church and all of it. "This doesn't lead anywhere that Emily would recognize." The gun had moved while she was talking, not dramatically. An inch, maybe two, the barrel drifting down toward the floor as if under its own weight. "You said that before," Hargrove said, "in the room, what Emily would recognize." "I meant it then," she said. "I mean it now." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze the way her mother had held the gaze of people in crisis, without flinching and without pressing, simply present, in the way that presence itself could sometimes be enough. "She was the best thing I ever did," he said. His voice had changed. The aggression was gone, and what was underneath it was naked and enormous. The grief in its original form before it had been processed into purpose. "Emily, she was the whole of it." "I believe that," Nell said. "Everything you have done since you lost her, even the worst of it, came from that, from how real she was to you." "She would have hated this," he said. He was looking at the gun in his hand with the expression of a man who has picked something up and cannot now remember exactly why. "Yes," Nell said. The gun came down. Hargrove's arm lowered to his side, and then he turned his hand and the pistol dropped to the floor of the small church with a sound that was enormously loud in the silence. Decker behind him exhaled. He bent down and picked up his own weapon and placed it on the nearest pew with the decisive movement of a man who has decided something and does not intend to renegotiate it. Morrison stood up slowly and crossed the church to where Hargrove was standing, and Hargrove let him come. And the two of them went out together through the back door, and the light that came in when the door opened was the clear October blue of the mountains, and then the door closed, and it was gone. The church was very quiet. Then Garrett Calloway, who had stood at the front of the church and watched the woman he intended to marry walk toward an armed man, exhaled once, and then Sawyer made a sound that was either a laugh or a sob, and could not quite decide which to commit to. And Mrs. Fisk said something about the cake in the tone of a woman who had decided that a crisis was over and it was time to return to the important work of the afternoon. Nell turned around. She walked back up the aisle. Garrett was watching her come, and his face was doing the thing it had done before, the face under the face, the one that went all the way to the bottom. She stood in front of him. "Where were we?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Reverend Aldous. "Please," he said. Reverend Aldous said, "We are gathered here today." And this time they got to the end. When the Reverend asked Garrett Calloway if he took this woman to be his wife, he said, "I do," in the voice he used for things that mattered, which was his quietest voice, the one with no performance in it at all, the one that was just the truth, spoken plainly. When he asked Nell, she looked at Garrett's face, at the gray eyes that had been watching her with the patience of the mountains for the entire length of this strange and eventful autumn, and she said, "I do," and meant every syllable of it down to the ground. He kissed her in front of the small congregation, gentle and real, and Mrs. Fisk began cutting the cake. They rode back up the mountain in that afternoon, the four of them, the sun already beginning its early descent toward the western peaks. The trail was the same one they had ridden down weeks before, and the same one Nell had first ridden with Cole and Sawyer on the day she arrived. But the trail itself was not the same trail, because you cannot walk the same ground twice when you have changed between the two walkings. The ranch appeared around the same curve it always appeared around, delivered without warning the way it had been delivered to her that first afternoon, and she felt the sight of it in her chest the way she had felt it then, but differently, the same expanse of log and stone and cleared ground and mountain, but hers now in a way it had not been then, not owned. That was not the word. More like recognized. The way you recognize something you belong to. Home, Garrett said. He said it quietly and without ceremony, the way a man says the thing that needs no elaboration. She looked at the cabin, at the garden along the south face, at the mountains behind it all, and she thought of 8 months ago, a room on the third floor of a building in Boston, a letter in her hands she had read until the folds were soft. Home, she said. The first winter taught her things that no letter could have described. The cold was the first lesson, cold that was not the damp misery of New England winter, but something altogether different, dry and sharp and enormous in scale. The kind of cold that made the air itself feel like a substance rather than an absence, that turned breath to visible cloud and frosted the inside of the windows in the early hours, and made the fire not a comfort but a necessity that you tended with respect. The second lesson was the dark. Winter dark in the high country came early and stayed late, and was absolute in a way that city dark with its ambient glow of windows and lamps in the streets never was. It was not unpleasant. She had not expected to find it not unpleasant, but there was something in the completeness of it that she came to appreciate, the way it defined the circle of the fire, and everything inside it made the cabin and the people in it specific and present in a way that summer, with its long light, did not require. The third lesson was Garrett Calloway in winter, which was different from Garrett Calloway in the other seasons. She had understood from the letters that there were days when the silence sat on him differently, that the quiet, which was usually simply his natural state, could become something heavier, a weather condition of the interior rather than just a preference. She observed this with care when she first encountered it, watching without pressing, and she found that what it asked of her was not solution, but presence. To keep the fire, to be in the room, to not require anything of him that required him to be other than what he was on those days. Her mother had called this witnessing. She had said there were people who needed to be witnessed in their hard moments rather than improved or redirected, and that witnessing was harder than either of those things and more useful. Garrett, for his part, learned the particular way her mind worked, which was not like his, but which was not incompatible with it. He learned that she needed to understand things completely, and that she approached a problem the way she had approached the horse in the corral on her third day, with patience and care, and the willingness to wait for the thing to meet her rather than forcing the meeting. He learned that her silences were different from his silences, that his were the silences of a man who had used up his words, and hers were the silences of a woman who was thinking and had not yet arrived somewhere worth reporting. He learned to tell the difference. It took him most of November. By December, they had found the rhythm that two people find when they are genuinely trying to find it. Not the rhythm of accommodation, not of one person bending to the shape of another, but the harder and better rhythm of two separate natures discovering where they naturally coincide. There was more of this territory than either of them had expected. It showed up in small things, mostly the way they both fell silent at the same moment when the light changed on the high peaks, the way they both preferred their coffee dark and strong, and were both disinclined to make much of it when something went wrong that could be fixed. The way they both tended to sit with a problem for a long time before speaking about it, and then spoke about it directly and without excess. Sawyer rode south in the first week of the new year, when the passes were still manageable. He came to supper the night before and ate 2 servings of everything, and talked about New Mexico and the country south of Taos, and the people he had heard described who lived and worked in that territory. He was excited in the way of someone who had been sitting on a decision for a long time and was relieved to be acting on it, and his excitement filled the cabin the way his talking usually did, generously and without apology. Cole said at the end of supper that the east pasture fence would need him to pay attention to it when spring came. Sawyer said he intended to be back before the fence needed attention. Cole said nothing to this, but he nodded. In the morning, Sawyer rode out with the particular energy of someone beginning something they have been waiting to begin, and Nell watched from the yard until the trees took him and then went back inside. Cole came in for coffee. He stood at the window the way Garrett stood at the window, looking at the place where his brother had disappeared into the pines, and he was quiet for a long time. "He'll be back," Nell said. "I know," Cole said. "He always comes back. He just needs to leave first each time. He's always been that way." "And you," she said, "do you need to leave?" He looked at her. He considered this with the seriousness he brought to questions that deserved it. "No," he said. "This is the work. I need to be where the work is." She understood this. She believed him. The winter passed in its own time, which in the high country was a longer time than the calendar suggested. Spring came in stages, first as a warming in the south-facing air, a slight relenting in the ferocity of the cold. Then as the first bare patches of rock appearing on the south-facing slopes above the cabin, then as the sound of water running again underneath the ice of the creek below the east pasture, and finally as the first green tentative and specific at the edges of the places where the sun reached longest. On an evening in late February, when the light was still thin and the cold was still real, but there was something different in the quality of the air, Nell put down the book she had been reading and looked at Garrett across the fire. He looked up. She had been thinking about how to say what she needed to say. She had been thinking about it for 3 weeks, running it through the part of her mind that her mother had trained to consider things from all the angles before committing to a direction. She had considered all the angles. "I need to tell you something," she said. He set down the leather work he had been doing. He gave her his full attention, which was the kind of full attention that felt like weather present and complete. "We're going to have a child," she said. "By the end of summer. Late August, I think." He was very still. She watched his face. She had watched it long enough now to read its deeper registers, the ones underneath the controlled surface, the ones he had not yet learned to contain because he had not needed to contain them before, because no one had been close enough to see them. What she saw was not what she had been prepared for, and she had prepared for a range of responses. What she saw was something opening in him, a kind of vast and quiet joy that moved through his face from the inside out and then underneath the joy. Something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it, the fear of a man who has been given something so valuable, he is not sure he can be trusted with it. He came off his chair and knelt on the floor in front of her, the way he had knelt in the high cabin, not from habit but from some instinct that this moment required it, and he put both hands carefully on either side of her face and looked at her. He said, "I will not know how to do this." "You will learn," she said, "the way you learned everything else, by doing it." "I'm not easy," he said. "I told you that from the beginning. There will be days." "I know," she said. "I have days too. That's not the question." He was quiet for a moment, his hands still framing her face, looking at her with the gray eyes that gave everything away to someone who had learned to read them. "What is the question?" he said. "The question," she said, "is whether you intend to be here for it. All of it. The good days and the hard ones and the ordinary ones in between." "You already know the answer to that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to hear you say it." "Yes," he said. The simplest possible word. The only word that was needed. They sat together by the fire as the February dark came down around the cabin, and the mountains outside did what they always did, which was to hold the world in their old stone hands without asking anything back. And the fire burned, and the dark was complete, and the high country cold pressed against the walls, and inside all of it, two people sat in the knowledge of what was coming, and found it was not frightening, but enlarging. The way all real things are enlarging, the way love is enlarging, the way the mountains themselves are enlarging, making you larger by making you understand how small you are in the best possible sense. A man keeps his word. Ahem. He had said it to her in the high cabin the night he went out alone into the dark, and she had understood it then as a statement about what he intended to do. She understood it now as something broader than that. It was not just about keeping specific promises in specific moments. It was about the daily repetition of a commitment that did not have an end date, the choice made again each morning, to be the person you said you were going to be, to build the thing you said you were going to build one day at a time with your own two hands. Built this together. That was what they were doing, what they would keep doing. 20 years is a long time to describe and a short time to live, which is the central paradox of a life well spent. You are inside it and it is moving and you are moving with it, and then you turn around and the distance between where you were and where you are is something you cannot quite account for, not because the time was wasted, but because the time was full. And fullness does not feel like passage the way emptiness does. November of 1898, Mancos, Colorado territory. The ranch had grown. Not sprawling, not lost its character, but grown the way things grow when they are tended by people who understand both what they have and what they want it to become. There was a second barn now larger than the first, and new corrals to the north, and a workshop where the old tool shed had been, and along the south face of the main cabin, A garden that had started as a kitchen garden and had gradually over 20 years of intentional expansion become something that people came from considerable distances to consult about. Nell Calloway was 42 years old. She had her mother's hands still quick and stained at the knuckles, though the stains were different now, the colors of a wider practice and a longer knowledge. She had acquired lines around her eyes that had nothing to do with sorrow, and the honey of her hair had some silver in it at the temples that she did not trouble herself about. She moved through the ranch the way she moved through everything, with the efficiency of someone who has learned the territory thoroughly and no longer needs to think about the ground. Garrett was 54 and slower than he had been in some ways, and faster in others, the way men of that age and constitution tend to be. Still physically imposing, but with the edges of it softened by time and by a life that had given him reasons to relax the readiness he had carried since the war. The gray in his beard was more gray than dark now. He still stood at the kitchen window in the early mornings with his coffee, but the quality of the stillness had changed. It was not the stillness of containment anymore. It was the stillness of satisfaction. A man at ease in his own skin and in his own home. Holt, their eldest, was 18. He had his father's height and his mother's eyes and a quality of attention that came from both of them, the particular focused intelligence of someone who was interested in many things and patient enough to pursue them properly. He worked the ranch with the competence of someone who had been born into the work which he had, and he had recently announced his intention to study law, and Garrett had said nothing about this for 2 full days, and then said it seemed like a useful thing for someone to know, and Nell had understood this as wholehearted endorsement. Eliza was 15 and had spent the last 3 years in systematic and thorough apprenticeship to her mother, which had been her own decision made at 12 with the serene certainty of someone who knows their own mind completely. She had already twice disagreed with the Mancos doctor about treatments for patients they had both seen and had twice been right, and the doctor had the grace to acknowledge this, which raised him considerably in Nell's estimation. Cade was 12 and was currently somewhere on the east pasture with Cole's eldest boy, doing something that probably involved the creek and would probably end with wet boots and a story worth hearing. Cole was 50 and unchanged in the ways that mattered. He had a wife, a woman named Margaret, who had come to Mancos from Denver on a matter of business related to a property dispute and had been caught in a rainstorm and had taken shelter at the Calloway Ranch and had stayed for coffee and then supper and had eventually stayed for the rest of her life, which was a story Cole told in exactly that number of words, and which Margaret expanded upon considerably whenever given the opportunity. They had 3 children of their own and a house on the east side of the property that Cole had built himself over the course of 2 winters. Every joint fitted and every surface finished with the same precision he brought to the barn and the corrals and everything else he decided to do. Sawyer had come back from the south as promised and had left again and come back again and eventually had stopped leaving, which he attributed to a conversation he'd had with a woman he met in Taos, and which had led in the fullness of time to her coming north with him and to a cabin of their own at the north edge of the property, from which on summer evenings you could sometimes hear guitar music drifting down through the pines. On this November evening, Nell stood at the kitchen window of the main cabin and looked out at the yard in the last of the day's light. The mountains behind the yard were going the color they went in the late afternoon and autumn, the gray stone picking up the warmth of the low sun and holding it for the few minutes before the dark came, and she had been watching this happen for 20 years and it had not diminished. She heard Garrett come in behind her. She heard him pour coffee. She heard him settle into the chair at the kitchen table, and she knew without looking what he was doing, which was reading the newspaper that had come up from Mancos yesterday. "Holt wants to talk to you," she said, "about the law school matter. He's trying to figure out the money." "I know," Garrett said. "We'll talk tomorrow." She turned from the window. The kitchen was lit by the lamp and by the last of the window light together, and the table had the remains of supper on it and the newspaper and Garrett's coffee cup and the small jar she had put on it that morning. Without thinking, dried flowers from the summer's last blooms, the same gesture he had made for her 20 years ago, in a room he had cleaned and prepared for a woman he had not yet met. She sat down across from him. He looked up from the newspaper. They looked at each other across the table in the October lamplight, and it was everything that had been between them and nothing that had not been earned. And the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that had been built over 20 years of the ordinary days that were in fact not ordinary at all. The meals and the long evenings and the hard seasons and the new lives and the losses and the slow accumulation of a shared history that no single moment could contain. I was thinking, Nell said, about the day I arrived. He put the newspaper down. He gave her his attention. At the station, Cole looked at me like I was weather coming in. She paused. And then you came across the yard and said 7 words and went back to the horses. He said, I remember. I honestly thought I had made a mistake. She looked at the jar of dried flowers on the table. And then Sawyer told me who had cleaned the room, who had put the flowers there. He was quiet. That was the moment, she said. That was when I understood that you were the person in those letters, even if you couldn't show it face to face, that you were. She considered that you were trying in the ways you could manage. He looked at the flowers. He looked at her. I'm still trying, he said. I know, she said. So am I. Outside the window, the last light left the mountains and the dark came, and with the dark, the particular quality of silence that the high country made in the evenings of late autumn. The wind through the pines and below it, something older and slower. The sound of a place that had been here before any of them and would be here after patient and enormous and entirely without judgment. The fire needed a log. Garrett got up and put one on. Nell refilled her coffee. They settled back to either side of the table, and the lamp burned between them. And the mountains were outside in the dark the way they were always outside in the dark, holding everything in their old stone hands. The mountain chose you. It had been 20 years since Sawyer said that to her on the wagon road coming up from the valley, and she had understood it differently then, as a thing about landscape and belonging, the romantic notion of a place selecting its people. She understood it differently now. It was not the mountain that had chosen. It was the people who had chosen the mountain again and again, every morning for 20 years, chosen the hard life and the honest ground and the work that required all of you and the love that asked you to be more than you were when you started. That was the choice, made fresh each day, made in the small gestures, in the steady presence, in the patient witnessing of each other through all of it. She looked at the man across the table, the man who had written 11 letters he could not send, the man who had walked barefoot up a mountain face in the dark, the man who had kept every promise he had ever made, not because it was easy, but because that was who he had decided to be. She thought I came a very long way to find you. She thought it was the right distance. The lamp burned, the fire settled. Somewhere north through the pines, the faint sound of a guitar. Somewhere east, the sound of a door Cade coming in from wherever he had been, the good kind of tired. From the yard, the stamp of a horse in the near corral, and the sound of the mountain wind coming off the high peaks with the smell of snow in it. The first snow of the season, still days away, but already present in the air, already on its way. Winter always ends. And before it does, it gives you the fire and the lamp and the table and the person across it, which is in the end everything that was ever promised, everything that was ever built.